Welcome to AI Realized, the podcast for enterprise executives leading AI deployments. From tackling security, data, and operational challenges to navigating organizational transformation, AI deployment offers a unique opportunity to redesign our organizations from the inside out. I'm Christina Elwood, your host for today's episode. We're talking today with Eric Siegel, the founder and CEO of Gooder AI and the author of the AI Playbook and predictive analytics, predicting who will click, buy, die, or lie. Eric, welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have this conversation. I'm a big fan of the other types of AI besides generative AI, predictive machine learning, other types of AI. And today we're going to zero in on predictive analytics. And so for our executives who are not familiar with predictive analytics and how it relates to the work that they may be doing in generative, can you please help us understand the connection and understand the basis of predictive analytics?
Yeah, sure. Predictive analytics or predictive AI, same thing, is everything, it was most everything that was referred to as AI up until 3 years ago with the advent of generative AI. So it's older, but not old school. It's learning from data to predict in order to target any and all of your existing large scale operations. So for fraud detection, credit risk scoring, targeting marketing, predictive maintenance, all of these use cases, all of your largest enterprise operations consist of millions of micro decisions, which are best informed by the holy grail for improving them is prediction. That is a probability. So learning from data to put the odds so we can play those odds games better. Now, like generative AI, it's built on machine learning. In fact, to clarify, these are really two categories of use cases of machine learning. But instead of learning from data to predict what the next word would be for a large language model to be writing text, it'd be on the enterprise level, an enterprise unit or element, the customer, the healthcare patient, the item rolling off the assembly line, the satellite that might run out of battery, any and all of that level of organizational and that level of granularity. Put the odds in the outcome or behavior. That's what's going to inform the per case operational decision.
So it sounds like the answer really to some of the problems that plague generative AI, which is hallucinations and so forth. So it sounds like they're a nice complement to each other. How are they typically used together?
They're generally not used together, but I very much see that as on the horizon and absolutely necessary. They really need each other. They address one another's weaknesses. And the weaknesses are that generative AI is by definition much easier to use. You can use it with English or other human languages. That's why they call it a language model. It's built on that, but arguably harder to use well in terms of reliably delivering or capturing, realizing concrete enterprise value. So making sure that the potentially aggressive or optimistic use case is feasible, that it's actually viable to be deployed despite the fact that the system's going to be wrong, right? That it's going to hallucinate, and there's other things that it does wrong, right? It could be jailbroken, it could be offensive. It's like comparing cats and dogs, right? Cats are much easier to manage, but much harder to train, right? Predictive AI, though, is used on use cases that are robust against error. You don't expect it to be perfect. There is no such thing as a magic crystal ball. Rather, we have the next best thing, which is putting probabilities and odds of those outcomes or behavior. So the problem with predictive AI is not that there's not a concrete use case. There is a concrete use case. There's decades of experience of positive track record of enterprise outcomes, but it's still only a small potential that's being realized. Most of those projects actually fail to deploy because it's harder to use. It deals with probabilities. Probability is just a number between 0 and 100. And again, we don't have absolute confidence. So we have to use that. We have to use probabilities. But, it's a little less magic seeming, right? It's a little bit less user friendly. It requires a bit of very accessible semi-technical understanding to make use of it. So I'd say if the weakness of generative AI is that it makes these mistakes, the weakness of predictive is that it's harder to use. So how do they resolve one another's weaknesses? If you're running a predictive AI project, there's lots of ways in which generative AI can make it easier and accessible to use predictive AI. So for example, in our product at Gooder AI, which establishes the business value of a predictive AI project so that you can maximize that value and communicate it credibly to stakeholders and get authorization and green light for it to be deployed, which is usually actually where the project stalls. We have an interface. You can interact with it and try what if scenarios for deployment. What if I use this model to target marketing in this way, or this fraud detection model to target my auditing team, or blocking credit card transactions in this way, whatever it is. It's not the rocket science part. It just has to do with steering the rocket and establishing its potential behavior, its performance in terms of the KPIs that matter. But it's a relatively new endeavor, so it could use a little kind of hand holding and guidance. So we actually put a specialized chat bot, it's built on Anthropic's Claude model, into the interface, and it allows you to ask any questions about the predictive AI project in general, about the product, our product, Gooder AI, about the levers and sliders and things you can move on the screen, what they all mean. Why does the profit curve go up and down? We've got a demo of that right on the top of our webpage at gooder.ai. So that's great, right? All of a sudden, you have this sort of well-caffeinated, well-informed, expert virtual data scientist available to ask any and all questions ad infinitum. There's no such thing as a stupid question. You're certainly not going to worry about that, knowing that you're not bothering a human expert. So there's all sorts of upside and advantages to bridging the gap to what's really just a semi-technical understanding that's necessary in order to drive these predictive AI projects by way of a chatbot. So that's one way in which generative helps predictive. And how about the other way around? If generative has this reliability issue, it has that potential to hallucinate and create other problems. That means that you might have a generative AI system, say it does customer service to end consumers. And you're supposed to be able to make changes to your reservation, or ask questions about the product, or make an order, or change to your order, whatever the customer service agent is supposed to do. The ideal is autonomy, right? We want the machine to be able to operate reliably enough that it could be unleashed. But the problem is that for most of those types of projects, you very quickly conceive of a scope of intentions of how the chatbot is supposed to be used. That's too audacious. It's too optimistic and ambitious. It's going to have errors. It may be correct, perform well, let's say 95% of the time, which is incredibly impressive technology-wise, something we never would have imagined possible just 5 years ago. And yet still potentially completely not viable, won't get deployed because that's too high of an error rate. But if you use predictive AI as another layer on top of that, and use it to learn about the cases that are most potential to have that negative outcome, to have that risk of poor behavior that would be unacceptable in a consumer-facing application. And by doing that, you can flag those most risky cases and potentially divert them to a human in the loop. Now, the human in the loop obviously is much more expensive than an automatic system, but there's a time and place they're needed. This system could be learning to target that accordingly, to be triaging and only using that expensive human in the loop for those more expensive cases. And the numbers may pan out really well. Where, for example, if you sent, let's say, the top 15% of most risky cases to have a human look at it and potentially intervene, which is more costly, maybe the net would be only 1% of cases would be problematic. And for some projects that may be viable, and the whole project can now potentially deploy. What does that mean? That means we've realized 85% of the otherwise audacious promise of autonomy, which is a lot better than 0% if you can't deploy the thing in the first place.
So that's a great example. Thank you for making it so vivid. So if I'm a business executive of a functional group in the enterprise and I'm considering an agentic solution for a customer use case, could I go to the Gooder AI website and ask it to help me understand what machine learning I would use, or what predictive model I would use in my agent for that 15% that needs to be shunted off to the human? So what do I need to use? And then what is the likelihood that it would provide me a certain outcome, so that then I can bring that to justify, I want to build this agent. I want to have this predictive analytics built into it to minimize the number of errors or problems that it causes. And I want to and I believe this will be the outcome based on the modeling that I have done. And I want funding to be able to go do that project. Is that how I would use Gooder AI?
Almost. It's a great question you're asking. So let me try to clarify. So our product, Gooder, is to help support an existing predictive AI project. And any and all type of predictive AI project, including the one I just mentioned, where you're layering it on top of Gooder, excuse me, where you're layering it on top of a generative AI system, that's just another predictive project like any other. And the nature of these projects, of any and all of these use cases for predictive, is that as I said, you're putting these odds on it. In other words, you're able to rank and triage the cases according to most likely down to least likely, highest risk down to least likely risk, or highest opportunity for targeting marketing. Either way, you're basically able to order it and draw a line. What I'm describing is the nature of most any predictive AI project. If you have an existing project, any of the above types of projects, Gooder will help you actually establish, maximize the business value so that you can actually then sell the project. That is to say, pitch it to get it greenlit so that it actually deploys, gets integrated into operations, right? If you don't deploy, you don't realize the value. The number crunching's only creates potential value, but you don't capture or realize that value until the operations don't improve if you don't change them. They need to be changed by way of the predictions. That's deployment. So any and all predictive AI project needs a data scientist. Data scientists will definitely not go away. You're not going to be fully automating those types of projects, but a data scientist has been trained to communicate in technical terms. Hey, look, this predictive model predicts a lot better than guessing. It has an area under the curve of 0.83. It has this and that and the other precision, recall, even accuracy is just a technical metric. They just are trained in general, and their tools support them in reporting those types of metrics that really are entirely arcane to the business. So there's a gap that greatly needs to be bridged between that and the business stakeholders, the person in charge of the operation meant to be improved by a predictive model, who of course is representing the business and cares about what? They care about business metrics like profit and savings, right? Monetary performance, or any and all other kind of KPIs. The translation from technical performance, pure predictive performance, to potential business value is generally not done. That gap is generally not bridged, and that's what Gooder AI does.
Okay, so going back to my scenario, if I'm a business executive with a potential use case, I would work with my data scientists to get whatever model they're recommending that we use for our use case. Then I could bring that to Gooder AI, or my data scientist could bring that to Gooder AI to frame the business value for communicating it to my peers and my board to get the financial support. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. Although,
Okay.
actually, at that stage of the project, there's already usually at least some financial support. Typically, what happens is the projects get greenlit and the resources are put towards the project, and then the number crunching takes place. It's sound, and then the project stalls because it hasn't been bridged. There may be additional financial resources needed to actually do the technical integration, that is to say, operationalization, deployment, whatever you want to call it. And then in that case, it would do exactly what you described, right? It would
Oh, yeah, so
actually
really
serve.
it's post POC, pre-deployment. It fits in that space
Yeah.
between I've
Well, yeah.
piloted, but I haven't deployed. Okay.
Yeah, if by POC you mean just the number crunching part. Sometimes people will say POC actually means at least some kind of pilot deployment. But the fact is most projects actually stall. That is to say, predictive AI as a field is failing like crazy. It's really a crisis. That doesn't mean doesn't have proven value. If only 15% succeed, that 15% of many projects is a lot of success. But overall, the track record is dismal. That field of predictive AI is still not professionalized in this way. There is a biz tech gap that is still not widely bridged.
Okay, so this helps to close that gap. Well, we were speaking recently with Adil Ajmal from Fandom, and he was talking about this very type of use case where they have an ad placement use case, they have customer support use cases, and so forth, where they're using this very combination. And it does put the data scientists front and center in their approach to how they develop the products and how they evaluate them before deployment, and then how they monitor them and adjust them when they're in deployment. So what you're describing, I think he vividly made clear the value to the business of having this combination in their particular case. As we prepare to get ready for AI Realized on November the 5th, the summit on November the 5th in San Francisco, where you will be one of our speakers, as will Adil, we should put the two of you together to talk about how you can combine your guidance for people into a clear action plan that people can take away with them and go back and use immediately. Because I think our listeners are going to readily understand the value of both of them. I think they're going to readily understand the high level of how you bring the data scientists together with the use case to be able to close this gap. I don't know that they will feel like they can fill in all the blanks on what that workflow looks like. So it might be worthwhile doing that unless you feel like you can articulate that today. I think that might be a good goal for us to set for sharing that at AI Realize Summit on November the 5th.
Sure, absolutely. As far as the workflow right now to this date, after decades of enterprise machine learning, predictive AI, whatever you want to call it, has been applied for targeting, for credit score, for targeting marketing and fraud detection, such an endless range of applications. To this date, the typical workflow is so close to complete and yet so far. There's this sort of no man's land between biz and tech, and both sides point to the other to say it's their responsibility. So the hose isn't connecting to the faucet. But what it comes down to at the core during the development of the model, before its deployment, they're just looking at these technical metrics, pure predictive performance. It tells you that it's very helpful. It tells you the model's better than guessing. It tells you that the data is sound, the analytics are sound, that the model is potentially viable, but tell you little to nothing about the potential business value. So it's basically one more step right after that. Hey, look, let's take this same test data that we're using to evaluate the model, but not just evaluate the model. Let's evaluate the model. That is to say, let's look at its performance in business terms of business metrics or KPIs, like profit savings or whatever applies for the organization. So it's just that gap, which solves two problems. One is in the development of the model, you're ensuring that what's always a semi-automatic iteration between train the model, test it, train, test, that the data science is conducting, that you're navigating the development towards actual value, because if you don't measure business value, you can't be pursuing business value. The second business problem is bridging that gap, and so that the data scientist now has a way to convey in meaningful business terms the potential value of the model to serve as the carrot at the end of the stick, so that the organization gets itself together and realizes, okay, we actually need to deploy this, which means we need to manage change. Operations don't improve unless they change. And in this case, we're talking about changing them with probabilities.
Gotcha. Now, I want to shift our gears a little bit here and talk about the books that you've written. I've really been enjoying Predictive Analytics. Love the title, by the way. I think it's just delightful. But you are a very good writer. You make these subjects easy and entertaining to understand. It actually, I have to say, is a brisk read. And for the topic, I think that's a pretty big accomplishment. That's a difficult thing to make a brisk read, but you do that very well. You wrote the predictive analytics first, and then you wrote the AI Playbook. Tell me a little bit about why you wrote them, who they're for, and who you recommend reads them today.
They're for both sides, both tech and biz, but first and foremost, they're for biz, because anything written just for data scientists is generally not going to be accessible. And I really appreciate your positive feedback. I did bend over backwards to offer the content here in a way that's meant to be relevant, relatively entertaining, and it's totally accessible, which thematically that aligns with what we're doing at Gooder AI. We're trying to bridge that gap. And the theme of my second book, the AI Playbook, is that we can't get these things deployed without bridging that gap, without fostering a very particular deep collaboration between tech and biz, which means that the decision makers, the stakeholders, the people who are usually not data scientists and are not doing the hands-on number crunching, do need to ramp up on a very accessible semi-technical understanding so that they can collaborate end to end across the the life cycle of the project from its inception to its hopefully successful deployment. So the point of the book is to offer the titular playbook paradigm framework that I call BizML, Business Practice for Running Machine Learning Projects, a 6-step practice described across 6 chapters. But first and foremost, that book, the AI Playbook, is meant to ramp up that business reader on that semi-technical, accessible understanding so that they can then participate in the execution of those 6 steps and actually collaborate deeply with the data scientists, get everyone on the same page, including the potential performance in business terms of the model, which is what we're handling technically with Good or AI, and get those darn models actually deployed.
Great. Deploying AI to production is what AI realized as a community is all about. So it's a perfect fit. And I believe that this complementary nature is demonstrated. Actually, I'm surprised that you find so much impedance in the market because I see it everywhere when I'm talking to enterprises. They've been using machine learning long before they were using generative AI.
Yeah, but
So
can I actually back that up a bit? I want to be clear. This is not just anecdotal is overwhelming, I might say. And I've been running the machine learning project conference called Machine Learning Week since 2009. But I was also involved with a couple rounds of industry research, and I'm not the only one conducting that kind of industry research. We do surveys of data scientists. IBM did one of the executives showing that those types of projects usually come out even in terms of their ROI rather than actually on average. And in all evidence points to the fact that just this comes down to the fact they just don't deploy. They stall. The industry has gotten good at sweeping those failures under the rug, but it's not sustainable. There's no reason for that track record not to improve. But this is real. This isn't just my opinion. The models are not deploying, and many viable models that could be delivering value. The project needs to reorient, reframe, present itself as a business project meant to improve operations that happens to necessarily use machine learning rather than being a machine learning project where people are fetishizing and focusing on the core number crunching itself rather than the use thereof. It's like being more excited about the rocket science than the launch of a rocket.
yeah, you see this in generative AI and in other areas of technology evolution where the adoption is not instantaneous. It takes time and it lags behind the enthusiasm. And in the case of generative AI, in October of last year, when we held the first AI Relay Summit, there was 3% deployment in enterprises. The most recent research that we have presented from BARC, which was supported by 3 or 4 other studies as well, is more like 19% today. So we still have plenty of places where it's not getting to prime time on the generative side too. So we don't want to repeat the mistakes that we've made in the past. If we've had friction associated with deploying machine learning projects and we're having friction in supporting generative AI projects deploying, we need to solve the problem of deployment. That's the problem to solve, not that we have
Mhm.
plenty of technology, we need to get it deployed. And besides the technology, or excuse me, so beside the issues that you've raised about the technology valuing the technology deployment, there is also the organizational issues, there are security and governance issues. So there are multiple issues at play here. We pull on this particular thread, we still have the other ones to solve. So I love that you have these books as resources for people to go to, and I will make sure that we include links to them in the show notes. Do you have other resources that you recommend our listeners use to either come up to speed on predictive analytics on this gap between the business value and the predictive value and the business value, or links that would help them to take their first steps?
That's a great question. I have to say that I've taken that on in terms of writing and the courses that I teach, that bridging that gap more than most people tend to be on one side or the other and stick to that side, which is fundamental to the problem. So, in addition to my books, I do have a course which is available at machinelearning.courses that encompasses the content of both of the books plus a bit more. And but there are other books. There are books by, for example, James Taylor, and he's a consultant. He comes really more from the business vantage and operationalization, business value side orientation. And yet he does a lot more than most, I would say, to bridge that gap. So I would say there's a general understanding that the gap is unbridged and needs to be, but somehow there's a lack of incentive system to be bridging the gap. Everyone's getting their salaries.
So what's your guidance for executives who are early in their adoption journey?
We build our product, Good or AI, to help bridge the gap. So we are always pitching to executives, hey, look at what you're expecting your data science to do. You know what? You're delegating a little bit, a little crucial bit too much to be on their side of the fence. And you need to, you or your VP or somebody needs to take a bit of a concrete look at the potential business value in concrete data-driven estimations of business value. Just dive in there a little bit. It's not super technical, but it has to do with what it means to improve a large scale operation. And to facilitate that, your data scientist can very easily take their model, put it into Gooder AI, look at its performance through Gooder's value-oriented lens, and then they can share that with you. You can move the levers on the screen. They are all business levers. So that's the purpose. You can think of this as de facto business console for predictive AI projects.
Oh, that's a great way to describe it. I like that. So, in your work, in working with executives to understand and benefit from AI, what's the leadership skill you find most useful?
Oh, great question. I feel like my main thing, and I think that's probably come across by now, is a clarification thing. Look, you need to look a bit into detail, right? The kind of detail I'm describing, it would be something like this. You've got a fraud investigation team. They could be, right now, they're investigating some random 7% of the transactions because that's how big the team is. They could be investigating a more finely targeted group of transactions that might be fraudulent by way of flagging those transactions with a model. So the model could flag the top 3% most likely to be fraud, or it could flag the top 7%, right? Which is a bigger group, which means it's not going to be as rich in fraud, right? Fraud detection is a needle in a haystack. We're talking about making the haystack smaller. But what's the exact arithmetic that translates that type of performance? It can identify, 3% of the transactions that are 7 times more likely than average to be fraud, or the 6% of transactions that are 3 times more likely than average to be fraud. Whatever those particular numbers are, how do you do the right math to translate that into the financial win of improved fraud detection and management, right? And how do we take that particular arithmetic for business value and put it into interactive visuals? You can try different potential deployment scenarios, right? So again, this is not the rocket science part. It's the part that's missing, which is steering the rocket so that you can be assessing and directing its use and performance to maximize business value. It's so my speech here is, look, the business side, either the executives or one or two level below them, need to actually get their hands a bit dirty. If you don't get your hands dirty, then your feet will get cold, because that's the scenario. The model is passed to you from the data scientist, and then you balk at its deployment because how can you get it without that visibility into potential business value? How can you change massive, ongoing, critical, large scale operations according to numbers if there's been you can't use something unless you've assessed its potential value from the business standpoint, not just the sort of arcane technical performance beforehand, so that there can be this credibility, this trust, this understanding of what value you expect to gain with deployment. So it's just a clarification. There's a certain amount of semi-technical insight and accessibility that needs to be made available to the business side, and that the business stakeholders need to actually immerse themselves in.
Great. Any last thoughts?
No, I'm really looking forward to the summit. I'll read off the title of my talk: AI business value is not an oxymoron. I think that's what we've been talking about. It's certainly a theme that applies for both predictive and generative in very similar, although also differentiated ways.
I love it. And we're really looking forward to having you. And thank you so much for your time today, Eric.
Yeah, my pleasure, Christina. Thank you.
Eric Siegel, co founder and CEO of Gooder AI. Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.